Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I like to discuss how Labour are making one last big push against complacency as we begin the long-awaited election year. Labour's campaign director was reported to be warning last week about poll collapses which have happened around the world for those who've been seen as a government in waiting. So what do Labour have to worry about, and how does voting intention change as we get closer to elections? But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel. So I've said for a while that this is Labour's election to lose now. The Tories have numerous things going against them, which I would summarise as follows. First, they've been in power for 14 years. Voters naturally start to question whether that run should continue, even if the government are generally doing all right. Second, the government have not been doing all right. Every aspect of government is broken. All public services are failing. The economy is shrinking in real terms. Trust in politics is at an all-time low. The economy's barely grown in any terms. People's standard of living is much worse than in 2010. And for those who can't remember that far back, is noticeably worse than it was a couple of years ago. Third, the Tories are riven with infighting. There's next to no discipline on show at all. They're also unable to distance themselves from their more unpopular elements. The public see a daily diet in the media of stories that Johnson or Truss could return to power with the Tories. The risk of this happening is not helping them. Fourth, the Tories are led by a political imbecile who, rather than surround himself with masters of the political arts, hired yes-men instead. But this does not mean the Tories have no chance technically, and opposition still has to win an election. I keep pointing out, even when the incumbent's losing. In 2019, the Conservatives were in the last days of Theresa May, their popularity was crashing, absolutely plummeting. Labour did not benefit from that. Their popularity plummeted as well. We ended up with a mad situation where the Lib Dems and Reform UK had more support in the country than Labour or the Conservatives. Back then, when Boris Johnson took over, people didn't believe the Conservatives were governing well. They didn't think Boris Johnson was an honest or a serious Prime Minister, but he still won a large majority because Labour was seen as worse. And it's always worth remembering, the opposition is considered an unknown quantity. It's quite common when you get towards the sharp end of an election for people to get wet feet and suddenly decide, fear of the unknown, it's enough to earn the incumbent government some extra votes from people who, though they might not be happy, think that, it's possible for things to be worse. This is why Morgan McSweeney, Labour's campaign director, is telling the top team about the 8 elections around the world where the clear favourites saw their poll lead collapse just weeks before the election. The big one, of course, would be the Labour Party of Australia. Not the last election, of course, they won that, the election before. They led in the polls for 2 years, just as our Labour Party are doing now. They lost the election, although they have, as I say, since won power. But we cannot afford this loss. Granted, the Australia Labour Party's poll lead was not large like the UK Party's lead is now, but it was still a consistent lead over a long period of time, and it evaporated during the election campaign. McSweeney apparently said that polls do not predict the future. Now, this is true. Polls simply reflect voting attitude at the time they're taken. And we know that they change. We often talk about polls tightening up as the election draws closer. It's not because things change as we get near the election. It's because voters' attitudes change. The way they look at the election changes. Like, you ask someone about their voting intention right now, it's a harmless activity. They can say what they like. They know there isn't an election, so they just go with their gut. Their intention doesn't actually matter. Once the election's been called, it's like something changes in your brain where voters suddenly realise, actually, my attitude matters now. I'm going to determine the next government. It's going to influence who has access to the levers of power within a matter of weeks. And they think about it very differently. Some voters, sick of the state of things and having previously been determined it's time for a change, get cold feet and think, I haven't actually starved to death yet, so maybe it's better the devil you know. The message from McSweeney is designed to prevent Labour's top team from getting complacent. After all, if you think victory is nailed on, then you already behave as if you're in government. You don't need to be as focused on certain policies which aren't that great but needed to win votes. I mean, you can think of it as a bit like a football match. If you're 5-0 up with 20 minutes to go, you slow down a bit. What's the point of going hell for leather and risking injury when you're cruising to victory? Except, of course, with an election, there is no such thing as 5-0 up with 20 minutes to go. The polls, as McSweeney says, are not a prediction of the future. There's nothing in the bag. There are no goals scored. Not a single vote has been won or lost yet, in strictly real terms. Not a single vote has been cast. And it cannot be cast until the earliest, a couple of weeks before polling day, for eager postal voters. We know that realistically a lot of voters have made their minds up and the Tories cannot credibly win back most of those votes they've lost. But they can win some back, or Labour could put off some if they currently lose discipline. You know, I look at voting intention polls in conjunction with polls on attitudes to various policies, and then Labour and Conservative behaviour as a way of looking to the future. That's because I don't directly influence the proceedings. I'm like the supporter in the stands. You know, but the players on the pitch have to keep giving it everything, working on the basis that they are at best just one goal up with plenty of time for the Tories to nick a couple in Fergie time. After all, although I went over some fairly beefy disadvantages for the Tories, they do have things in their favour as well. First, they get to choose when the election is held. Second, because they're currently in power, they are able to engineer economic and other figures to an extent to look best when that election is held. Third, they have the mainstream media almost exclusively on their side. Fourth, they are seen as the default party of government in the UK. People are generally used to voting for them. And fifth, they have absolutely no scruples. They will make promises in their manifesto which they know they don't intend to keep. And of course, I could add a sixth, as I've already mentioned before. There are voters who just get cold feet and decide to vote for better the devil you know. Now, of course, Labour could never get away with making manifesto promises that they will not keep en masse. So in terms of the rallying call coming now, it's not just because we've entered election year. The Guardian article on this makes the point that shadow ministers are having to finalise their manifesto policies. After 14 years of Tory mess, there are an awful lot of policies you would want to have. You know, if you're on the cusp of running a government department, there's an awful lot you would like to do, yeah? But Labour are making sure that all of their plans are fully costed. The phrase being used is bomb-proof. It's going to be an intense period of negotiations amongst themselves for the shadow cabinet over the next few weeks. And it's important that they work together, recognise they're on the same team, and come up with policies which will inevitably require funding, but not see each other as competing for that funding as such, not in a way that's destructive. You know, we don't want to see a situation where shadow ministers are in competition with each other right now. This meeting will have been partly to make sure that that competition does not turn into disunity. Because another important point to consider is the campaign itself. I keep saying, if campaigns didn't have a massive impact, you wouldn't be spending so much money on them. Political parties save up huge war chests just for the election campaign. They don't have their campaign spend and then increase it a little bit at the election. Almost all of their spending is in the period leading up to polling day. The election campaigns will influence voters in a way we cannot pick up on with the polling as it currently stands. Also, there will be the performances themselves. In 2017, the Tories suffered a polling collapse. They thought they were on for an easy increase in their majority. Oh, piece of piss. But Theresa May turned out to be unexpectedly useless at engaging with the public. Now, I've said that I expect Sunak to be terrible. The Tories do as well. This is why he's been hiding on by-election polling days. Keir Starmer is more of an unknown quantity. On the one hand, he has been out and about. He certainly hasn't hidden away during local and by-election campaigns. But we also know he can be a bit awkward in interviews. How will he be during the crucible-like heat of a general election campaign? I don't think he'll melt. It'd be ridiculous because he's been a top prosecutor. So I don't think he will wilt like Theresa May did. He's been tested in other harsh arenas, but will his manner work for or against Labour? We can't really be certain because we can only judge the reaction of committed voters so far. People who've been taking part in local elections and things like that and by-elections. They are the ones who go out and vote regularly. They're not the sort of ones who are largely disinterested in politics but turn out for a general election. You know, the extra people who do vote in general elections and tend to steer clear of the others are a different beast. We don't really know how they are going to react to Starmer yet. Essentially, Labour have to expect a drop in the polls come the election, possibly a savage drop. They just need to be far ahead enough that it will still carry them to a sizable majority, even if the not ridiculous majority being suggested by current polling. The good news is, if you look at where Labour are in relation to other opposition parties before winning power, they're well ahead. They're well ahead of the game, no matter when the election is. You could argue as well it would help Labour if the election were in autumn. After all, if the Tories trigger the election in May, it presumably means they've cut the poll lead enough for them to be confident, and the campaign itself could cut it further. But if Labour can maintain the current poll gap, force the Tories to panic and go long, it could make them pay for their cowardice. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. And until next time, I'll see you later.